It's time to catch up with Helen Dale for our weekly conversation about all things to do with the wokeness, the unwokeness, and in particular this week, the problem with censorship and the problem with people who like to burn books effectively, or at least not have them printed because they think something in them might be offensive. Helen, a very good morning to you. Welcome.
Morning, Mark. How are you?
No, not bad at all. The good fight goes on. This week, J.K. Rowling's been in the news again because a lot of people have been upset by her latest book, which most of them haven't read, in which they think she upsets them, but they don't quite know how.
No, this has been a perennial problem in the world of literature and writing over many decades. But it was generally considered non-you if you were a reviewer or a commentator about literature and the arts, not to comment on books you hadn't read, films you hadn't watched, and concerts you hadn't attended.
Right.
I mean, that was sort of the informal social norm that I certainly had imposed on me from when I first started out as a writer and commentator, because I did a lot of literary journalism, that if you did that, it marked you out as an amateur, and it also marked you out as a very rude person.
Right. Well, it also would have opened you up to all sorts of accusations of inaccuracy as well, because you can't really critique something you haven't looked at, can you?
Exactly. And also, I mean, I'll give you an example. We've discussed a number of books that I've reviewed for different outlets, from the Spectator and CapX and the Critic and so on and so forth. And I often hold them up, and you'll notice they have a little strapline on them that says uncorrected proof, review copy only, not for sale, that kind of thing. And one of the informal arrangements amongst reviewers and writers is, if it says uncorrected proof, you are not allowed to go to town in the review about all the typos in it.
Right.
And the reason you can't is because it hasn't had a chance for its final round of copy edits at the publisher to fix up the typos. So that gives you an idea of the informal norms that used to exist. And that means those informal norms that used to exist, that have basically been blown up in the last 5 years, I think, is that if there were an attempt to cancel a novelist in the past, you know, to really heavily criticize the book and criticize the author, really have a go at them for their politics or for the way they portrayed a historical event or the way they portrayed a particular character. If the book was a roman à clef, which means it uses fake names, but if you're reasonably alert, you can detect who it's about.
Right.
Now, that meant, for example, this happened to me 25 years ago with this book. Now, the difference...
This is the hand that signed the paper. This was quite a controversial book, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was very controversial in Australia because it won the Miles Franklin, which is the Australian equivalent of the Booker Prize. But it was moderately controversial in other places. Now, it was unpleasant for me. I got a lot of abusive mail and all of that kind of thing, which is when your book is controversial. But I was not cancelled. My book was not cancelled. The effect of all the controversy was simply to turn it into a massive bestseller.
Right. Well, that's always helpful.
That is what is happening to J.K. Rowling now. Even though it's not written under her name, it's written under her pen name that she uses, her pseudonym that she uses for adult fiction, Robert Galbraith. And I don't blame her for doing that, because her own birth name is irrevocably associated with kids' books.
Yeah.
So if you want to go and write crime fiction, it makes sense to use a pen name. And it was kind of unfortunate because she originally meant to keep it a secret. Right. And when I did my first book, I meant to keep it a secret too. But it's very, very hard, and eventually get found out. And that happened to both of us. Right. But the change that has happened with literature is that if you're a big name like Rowling, or even a middle-ranked author like me, if you've won a few prizes and you've had books already published, or your book is already on the bookshelves, and there's this attempted cancellation, you just create an enormous bestseller. And that is now happening to the Galbraith book of Rowling's. Right. Everyone's decided to blow it up ridiculously, and Rowling is going to make as much money out of that as she did out of one of her Harry Potter books, I suspect.
And this new sort of cancelling of characters and of people and of writers has also kind of fed into the acting world, hasn't it? Where we've got now lots of productions where they say, well, obviously, if somebody's going to play a lesbian, it must be a lesbian who's playing a lesbian. If somebody's going to be a gay man, it must be a gay man that plays that part. You know, there's sort of acting's gone out the window.
Well, yes, the whole raison d'etre of acting is supposed to be you pretend to be someone that you're not. That's the essence of it.
Right.
And people who have, I mean, and that's why until relatively recently, if you got an actor or an actress like Meryl Streep or Gary Oldman, who played real people who existed in the living memory of large populations of the world, and in those cases it was Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, the skill of the actor or actress would be rewarded if they were very good at doing that, because they had successfully convinced the audience that they looked like and sounded like and behaved like Winston Churchill or Margaret Thatcher. And that's why in both those cases, Meryl Streep and Gary Oldman, they got Oscars. You know, that was the rationale for acting was, oh my goodness me. I mean, yes, I realise there's a makeup department, but Meryl Streep really did sound like Margaret Thatcher. It was incredible.
Yes.
You have to respect that skill. It's a remarkable skill.
I mean, Meryl Streep's accents, all told, are brilliant. You know, she's been in Sophie's Choice. In Sophie's Choice, I thought her accent was amazing as well.
Yeah, the only one she really struggled with, and I understand this because the stresses in the vowels and consonants are in a different place. She struggled with Lindy Chamberlain.
Yes.
In Evil Angels.
The dingo stole my baby, that one.
Yeah, it's very hard for an American to do an Australian accent. It's relatively easy for a British person to do an Australian accent.
Yes.
And it's relatively easy for an Australian to do a British accent
right.
or an American accent, Mel Gibson.
Right.
But if for a whole range of linguistic reasons, and you'd need to get an academic in linguistics to explain this, get someone like Steven Pinker, it's actually very hard for an American to do an Australian accent. And I felt for her when I watched that film, because otherwise the acting was excellent.
It was a great film as well. I really enjoyed it. It's one of those that, well, if it's on again, you always want to watch it. Let's talk about another piece that you've written this week, Helen, about what you call curtain twitching feminism, which sort of feeds in not just to the way that everybody's watching everybody else, but also this whole idea that we should be shopping and snitching on our neighbours if they have more than 6 people in the garden.
Well, yeah, my original aim with the Penthouse piece that I wrote and that you've retweeted was to point out that the way the whole Karen phenomenon is being dealt with is kind of misconstrued. They're coming at it from the wrong end of the snake. Now, what initially was a slur directed at, in America, white middle-class women, and in this country, white lower middle-class women, because we have a more finely grained class system than the Americans do, was this tendency to be an interfering busybody.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be mainly, at the beginning, all the videos that went around the internet, it seemed to be mainly white people, white women doing it to black men. However, we've now since seen many, many more videos all around the internet, and very simply they can just be summarized as women doing it to men, regardless of their politics. And I think that the BBC was being vicious when they used Karen as a slur to go after every woman who has ever gone to ask for the manager. That's off.
Yes.
And I have no problem with saying that that's off behaviour. But I do think it is fair to say, and this is the point that I made in the Penthouse piece, that for many decades, feminism encouraged women to do something they are more statistically likely to do anyway. And that is the tendency to ask for the manager, to dob, to snitch, to use relational aggression, typically against other women, but also against men, rather than the standard male square go, as the Scots say. Get Neil Oliver to talk about that next week, outside the pub. And so basically all that lean in feminism and speak up feminism, it was based on studies that don't replicate. So psychology's in the dock again. So you get all these academic studies saying that men talk over the top of women, or they talk more than women in mixed conversations.
Mansplaining and all that.
Mansplaining and all of that. Now, they have been felled, like most of the discipline of psychology has been felled, and sociology as well, by the replications crisis. And what evidence we do have seems to be that the only time men talk over women is in very specific isolated circumstances, and there's even a suggestion that the men in question actually have to have Asperger's, which is a mild form of autism, and can be very disabling.
I think most men have now been sort of cowed into submission when it comes to that, because they don't want to be accused of it, apart from the else. This is why I said yesterday it was quite a clever move to put Angela Rayner up against Boris Johnson, because no matter what he did and no matter what he said or how he spoke to her, he would be accused of that.
Well, yes, he'll just come across in the worst possible way in every sense.
Yeah.
And not just because he's a bloke and white, but also because he's posh.
Yes.
And Angela Rayner is one of the few people in Labour who isn't posh. You know, she's genuinely working class.
Yeah.
You know, didn't finish any A levels and all of this kind of, used to be a carer, you know, a proper representative of that Labour tradition. So it's actually very difficult on a number of levels. It would be like having a ding dong with someone who came up as through the shop floor and as a shop steward and then became senior in the trade union movement, not because they went to university, but because they started on the shop floor. Very, very hard to argue with someone like that.
Right, exactly. And so that's what I mean. This whole kind of, I mean, there's not, you have to be a very brave man indeed, and probably very out of touch with the way things are, certainly in the media, to talk down to anyone, really.
Well, and this is the thing, this Karen behaviour, which is now managing to annoy everybody across the spectrum, and is also producing, in response, some really pretty awful sexism. It's made it publicly acceptable to say really awful things about women, especially if you're a black person or a brown person, although not necessarily. Some of it's come from other women, which is classic female competition with other women. But the thing is, it's been encouraged for decades, and it's now producing this behaviour that you really don't want to encourage. And now I'm going to take a pop at the government, but I could equally take a pop at the opposition as well, because I know they would be doing the same thing, encouraging people to snitch on their neighbours. Now, obviously, the state has to enter the private sphere of the Englishman's home as his castle sometimes. I mean, one of the big fights going back over 100 years was to deal with things that often happened in the family home. First of all, domestic violence. Yeah. You had to train people into calling the police, or otherwise women were murdered. Yeah. And the other thing was terrorism. These are serious things. You know, if you see something, say something. Sometimes it meant that the police could head off a terrorist attack. But inevitably, what has happened now is we've seen the emergence of a slippery slope. So things where the police should enter the private sphere, the family home, things where it really matters, like domestic violence and terrorism, we're now talking about reporting your neighbours because they have 7 children playing in the backyard rather than 6.
Yeah.
But
do you not think it's also the inevitable kind of slow move towards all of that kind of virtue signalling type behaviour, whereby, you know, not only do you start snitching on people for slapping their children around, but you then start snitching on them for driving a car that runs on diesel, or, you know, calling the environmental police because somebody's having a bonfire.
Well, or using fireworks, or all of these things where people, it does impinge on others, but you have to come up with some sort of modus vivendi, or it becomes impossible to have civil society and a normal life. But yes, it's broadly being able to call up the police and say, my neighbour has too many children playing in his or her backyard. Yeah, is quite close to promoting how pure you are on Twitter. You know, you donated to this charity, or your opinions are completely woke, you know, and it's the current year and 2020, and we should be, you know, trans women are women, and all these sort of mantras that you're expected to recite. Yeah. It's a classic example of attempting to be pure rather than attempting to be good. Right. Because being good is kind of hard. Right. Also, if you really are good, you don't really necessarily need to tell everybody else. Well, no, because you know it in yourself. Right. Whereas if you're trying to be pure, that involves external assessment. So it involves really extraordinary behaviour, and snitching on people, curtain twitching, as Australians call it, dobbing, which is a nice word. Although a friend of mine who grew up in East London says they also used to use dobbing in Dagenham. People in it, yes, dobbing people in it, in Barking and Dagenham when he was a lad. So it's not just Australian, but just this whole culture of, I'm going to make myself a better and more pure person by telling on other people and making their lives appreciably worse without any particular consequence attached to that. And one thing, I mean, I was just actually talking to the lady who I spoke, Professor Katie Barnett, who I spoke about last week, who was hassled by the police, and that's become a big news story in Australia. And we were talking about the extent with these coronavirus restrictions, and remembering she's in Victoria, is that, you know, science is like a lot of things. It's a wonderful servant, but it's a terrible master.
Yes.
And we are discovering now, with the assaults on our civil liberties and the also just general incoherence, because the government is in conflict as well. It doesn't quite know whether it's coming or going, and the scientists disagree with each other, because there is never any such a thing as the science. Right. It's always an argument. It should be an argument of scientists as well as an argument of lawyers. I don't know why they don't have a different name, but a different collective noun. But she just made the point. She said, we cannot let these abstractions rule us, because otherwise we finish up losing all the things that make our society worth living in and make it worthwhile.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right, Helen. We've got to leave it there because we're out of time, but thank you very much indeed.